very first Restless Retirement Planning event. I'm Melanie Wright and I'm Restless Money Editor, and we're delighted to have you all here with us. The run up to retirement can be really daunting, and lots of us might be unsure about certain things that will affect the amount we end up living on when we stop work. We all know this can feel a bit overwhelming and can make us bury our heads in the sand and worry about retirement planning later. But if we don't address these issues as soon as possible, it can prove a costly mistake. Here, we're joined by Restless pensions expert Katrina Swindlehurst about some of the challenges facing those close to retirement and what steps people might be able to take to manage their income when they finish working. Towards the end of the presentation, we'd like to read out some of the questions you might have, although you do need to remember we can't offer individual financial advice or specific recommendations. If you do have any questions you'd like to address, then do please get in touch with Restless Pensions and request a free pension health check, and we'll explain how to go about that later. Katrina, thank you very much for joining us. I thought it might be helpful to start with a few basics around retirement planning that can sometimes leave people confused. One of the reasons I think retirement planning can feel so daunting is because we often hear about the vast sums people need to save to enjoy a comfortable retirement. So how much do people really need to be saving for their futures?
Thank you, Mel. Yes, it's one of those challenging questions, isn't it? Really, there are several things that you really need to consider. And I would say the first point, the point that you need to consider is what sort of income do you actually want to retire on? What are you actually going to need? And I would strongly suggest this is the pivotal part of retirement planning, actually having a look at your expenditure, having a look at your budget, and having a look at what do you actually need as a baseline figure. What is your minimum income requirement to keep your house heated, to keep your lights on, and to feed yourself, and so on. Lots of the current bills that you're paying at the moment won't disappear just because you're retired. Some of them will, because you won't be traveling to work and so on, but a lot of them will remain the same. So it's really working out that minimum income requirement that you need, that bottom line. So that lets you know what your target is, what you're looking to achieve. And then anything over and above that is your discretionary spend, the things that you can treat yourself with and so on, knowing that you've got that baseline income in place. After that, what you really need to look at is how much are you, how far away you are from retirement now. So what is your retirement journey? Where are you now and when are you looking to retire? And then having a look at how much you've currently saved. So what have you got in pension pots and other investments that you can earmark for your retirement journey? Once you've done that, you really need to look at also the levels of contributions you are making towards your retirement plans, towards your pensions. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be employed at the moment, you will be receiving employer contributions. So, auto enrollment came along and everybody had to be offered a retirement plan. And what that means is that your employer has to, as a minimum, pay in 3% into your pension. That's on the proviso that you yourself are paying in 5%. Now, you only actually have to pay in 4% because the government kindly pay in 1% of that for you. So for your 4% personal contribution into your workplace pension, your employer will pay in 3%, and then the taxman will actually pay in the additional 1%. So you have 8% as a minimum if you're fortunate enough to have a workplace pension. So having a look at what you're paying in, whether it's through a workplace pension or through your own arrangement. And then also looking at what else you could afford to do. Does budget restrict you, or do you have flexibility to pay in more? So those are the key areas. Look at what you need, what you're aiming for, look at what you've got in place, look at your contribution levels, and look, is there anything more you can do? The key line here is save as much as you possibly can. That would be my parting comment on that.
Absolutely, not always easy in these times, is it? But presumably the type of pension you have will also have a bearing on the amount people end up with, because there are various different types we hear about: final salary, money purchase. Can you explain briefly what the main types of pension that people might have are, as there's a lot of jargon to get to grips with?
Absolutely, yes. So I'll try and demystify that. There's two main types of pension schemes. So we have our workplace pensions, which we've just talked about, and then you have any personal plans that you may have set up yourself. So if we look at workplace pensions in the main, and these are normally made up of two types of scheme, and they can be what we call a defined benefit or final salary, as you mentioned there, or a defined contribution. Okay, so the key differences between those are a defined benefit or a final salary scheme. How your pension is dictated is dependent on how many years you worked for that employer and what your final salary was when you left that employer. Then they'll use a calculation to dictate what your income will be when you come to retire. So they'll actually tell you from the outset, after X number of years, assuming this salary, this is what your regular guaranteed income will be from your nominal retirement date. So they'll let you know what the retirement date is. So from, say, age 65, you are set to get X pounds per year guaranteed for the rest of your life. That's a defined benefit scheme. The other alternative is a defined contribution scheme. And they are where an employer may well pay into you for your workplace pension. You're paying in your own contributions, and those contributions are invested on your behalf. So they're invested in a variety of investments you can choose. The income that will be generated from that when you come to retire will depend on the size of that fund when you come to retire and the options you decide to take when you come to retire. That will dictate the income. So there's a certain element of uncertainty around those, dependent on fund performance, how much you're paying in, and then the actual income you take when you come to retire. So those are the two key differences. One, you'll know what you're going to get. So that's your defined benefit. So you're knowing what you're going to get. And then there's the defined contribution where it will be fund dependent. How big is your fund? And that will then dictate what income you get from it. So those are workplace pensions. Then you have your own, you could have set up a plan yourself. Say, for example, you're not eligible to join a workplace pension scheme or you're self-employed. There are several different types of personal arrangements you can set up. You may well have heard of stakeholder pensions, for example. These were introduced to provide a cap on charges within pension schemes, to provide a default investment option so that if you were uncertain of where you should be invested, this pension scheme would provide you with a default so you could invest into that. Also stripped away any penalties, so you could actually then move your pots around, so you could take your stakeholder pension with you and join another scheme. You also have what we call self-invested personal pensions, and that's where you have much more freedom over how you select where your money is invested. So you can choose from a vast array of investment options. You can even put properties in them and so on. So there's a lot you can do with those, but those are the decisions you need to make yourself. So those are the two key parts. So you've got your workplace pensions, and so you've got your employer paying into those and you're paying in, and how those benefits are paid are separated out through defined benefit. You know what you're going to get when you retire, or fund size. And likewise with private pensions, they are working on a defined contribution basis. So you're paying in, the funds are invested, and what they're worth at the end, that total fund value, will then dictate the amount of income you can get from it.
And I guess that's something people are really worried about at the moment, where their pension savings are invested. They might have seen their pension pot fall because of everything that's going on. How do people find out where their pension is actually invested, where the money's going?
Yes, there's two main ways that you can look. Well, three actually, because now you can go online. Most pension providers have busy apps, and you can go in and you can have a look and see where you're invested. Or the other thing is to contact your pension provider and actually ask them for information on where your funds are invested. Or the other, if you're in a workplace pension, you may well have to contact the trustees of your scheme to ask them how the monies are invested and where they are. In the main, especially in workplace pensions, there will often be a default fund. And this was introduced, these parameters were introduced for those that didn't know where to invest and didn't feel comfortable making their own investment choices. So they come up with a default option. So, you tick a box and that's where your money's invested. And how they normally work is, as you get closer to retirement, They move away from some of the higher risk investments into a safer, lower risk, lower volatility environment. So kind of ring fencing and capping the fund that you've grown as you get closer to retirement. So they tend to use then cash and bonds for those investments as you get closer to retirement to protect you from the ups and downs that we're experiencing in the stock market at the moment. There's always, within most pension funds, there are other options of what you can actually invest into. So it's always worth exploring and having a look at what you can go into. And for some of the more experienced investors, as I mentioned before, there are the self-invested personal pensions, SIPs, as we know them, where they have a vast array, they have huge amounts of choice and so on, where you can then select yourself. The key thing is that can be quite daunting. As I said, experienced investors roll up their sleeves and it's wonderful. It's a great opportunity. For those of us that are slightly less experienced or not had that exposure or understand quite how these assets work, it's always worthwhile seeking advice. Talking to a financial advisor, or any financial advisor would then come up with an investment plan for you, how you should be investing, that suits your appetite for risk, and also suits your timescale. So, we spoke earlier about planning. How long have we got? How long have you got till you retire? A drop in the market that we're seeing at the moment isn't the worst thing if you've got a long way to go, because it doesn't actually impact you. However, if retirement is just around the corner, then there are other things you need to consider. But it's always down to individual circumstances, individual views, your ability to actually carry the cost of investment and so on. So one of the key things is making sure you're investing in the right places that are comfortable for you, and also keeping an eye on those charges. How much are you paying for that investment? The more you have invested, the more you're paying in charges, the less that's invested for your benefit moving forward.
Absolutely. And of course, lots of people are going to be heavily dependent on the state pension when they retire, as well as workplace pensions or any private pensions they might have. How do people check their entitlement? How do they know how much they're going to get from the state pension?
Yeah, state pension, it makes a huge difference, and one of the key things is to make sure that you understand what you're going to be receiving. Now, the government website gov.uk, you can go in, and we have a great, actually, if you go into the Restless website, just search state pensions, and the first article that comes up answers the vast majority of your questions, and it has some fantastic links in there. You can then go in, you provide some of your personal information, and what it will do is give you a forecast of what you can expect to get when you reach retirement age, state retirement age. Now, state retirement age is currently 66. It's due to increase to age 67 at 2026. Sorry, I've got these dates written down just in case I forget them. And then it's due to increase again to age 68 from 2037. So it is going up. So also, if you go into the gov.uk website, it will tell you what your retirement date is. What it will also do is tell you what your entitlement is. And so state pension, as it stands at the moment, you need to have a 35-year national insurance contribution record to get the maximum state pension available. Okay, so 35 years. If you've been working for 35 years and you've been paying your national insurance all the way through, you will be entitled to the maximum state pension, which is currently £9,339.20 per year. If you go into that website, it will actually let you know if you have any gaps, so you haven't maximised that opportunity. And what you could then explore is actually making additional contributions to make up for those lost years, so that you can then benefit from that maximum state pension. Because when you're looking at budgeting, if we go back to originally what I said, having a look at what you need in retirement, if state pension then comes along, and that's a guaranteed income source, and it has these wonderful triple lock, which the Chancellor, I think, has just announced that they are going to be continuing for the next year. It's a case of that triple lock keeps line with inflation, wages, and so it keeps that pace with inflation, which is a very valuable source at the moment, especially when going into a period of uncertainty when it comes to inflation. So I urge you all, go into gov.uk or go to the Restless website, put in state pensions, have a look at that article, but also click on the gov.uk site, put in your details. It will let you know when you're due to retire and how much you're due to get. And if you do have any shortfalls, it will also let you know how you can go around paying any additional contributions to make sure you maximise that benefit.
What about people who perhaps are going to be heavily dependent on the state pension and don't have maybe much in their workplace or personal pension? What would you say to them if they might be worried that they're never going to be able to stop working, they're not going to have enough to live off in the future?
Yeah, it's retirement itself has changed. It used to be this one-off event where you would retire at state retirement age and you would receive your workplace pension, and that's how it would go. However, what we're seeing now is retirement, it tends to be more a flexible approach. What we're seeing is people are working beyond state retirement age, and that's either for two reasons: through choice. They're keen to keep working and they feel that they can contribute to the workplace and they've got a lot more to give. And that's a wonderful choice to make and keep going. So you have that flexibility. But also we're seeing the downside, which is also people are having to work beyond state retirement age because, as you rightly said, Mel, that they just don't have the funds to actually support what they need, that minimum income requirement, keeping their lights on and heating their home. They need to continue working. So pensions have changed a great deal in the last few years, and what we're seeing now is a more flexible approach to retirement, and actually is often with a lot of people it's a staged retirement. I'm having conversations with people off the back of the pandemic, particularly frontline workers that have found the last few years have just been really tough. And although before you'd spoken to them a few years ago, they would have kept going to state retirement age, they now feel that actually there's a need for their own physical and mental well-being to reduce hours, to look at alternatives. And that's where, if you've built up pension funds in your own name, it gives you that degree of flexibility. You can start looking at reducing your hours and then supplementing that loss in income through your own private arrangements, which can then get you through to state retirement age. So that it gives you that ability to keep going a little bit longer, to bridge those gaps. And there's lots of planning that you can do to keep that going. The other thing to remember is there are alternatives outside of pension. So, for example, if you own your own property, you could look at perhaps downsizing to release some of the equity in your own property. There are also equity release products that actually allow you to stay in your property, but release some of the equity, which could then help you and support you into your retirement. As we said before, the other key thing is you can keep working longer, which is wonderful if it's through choice. It's quite tough if it's through necessity. So having a look at what your options are. The key thing also is it's never too late to start a pension. If you're in a workplace, you've been offered a workplace pension and you've only got a few years to go, you may well think, well, it's not going to make a difference. It will make a difference. Every penny will count when you come to retire. So it's never too late to start a pension. Start paying in, start taking advantage of the tax relief, and start taking advantage of employer contributions.
But given that there may be these other options which you've just touched upon that are worth considering, and you can also pay into ISAs and other types of investment, what are the main reasons people should bother with pensions? Okay,
yeah. Well, I've touched on this a few times now, is one of the key benefits of a pension plan is tax relief. There are very, very few savings environments, if pensions may be the only one, where you actually receive tax relief on any contributions you pay in. For example, if you were to pay £80 from your net pay into a pension scheme, the government would pay in an additional £20 into that. So they'd top it up at basic rate tax. So 20% would go in on top of what you've contributed. So your funds would automatically grow by that 20%. The key thing to remember is then also, if you're fortunate enough to be a high rate taxpayer or an additional rate taxpayer, you can get additional tax relief as well, and that's through your tax return. So for higher rates, those fortunate enough to be in a high rate tax position, there's an additional 20% tax relief that you can claim through your tax return. And for additional rate taxpayers, that's an additional 25% that you can claim. When you look at those rates of tax relief, it becomes quite a compelling argument as to why you should save into a pension. So that's where it becomes very, very useful. And that's automatically done for you if you're a basic rate taxpayer. And as I said, through your tax return, if you're a high rate taxpayer. So that's the first advantage of a pension and a good compelling argument. The second one, as again, we've alluded to it earlier, is employer contributions. There's nothing else probably that your employer is willing to pay into on your behalf. They have to pay into a pension if you're in a workplace environment. So they're under auto-enrollment rules, they have to pay in a minimum of 3%. So take advantage of that. Join your company scheme, take advantage of their 3%. If you pay in your 4%, the government will add in 1%. So that's an 8% contribution going into a pension plan for your 4% investment. Again, another really compelling argument as to why you should select saving into a pension as part of your retirement planning. The other key thing to remember about pensions is they aren't as rigid as they used to be. There's a lot of talk. A few years ago, we introduced pensions freedom, which was giving us a lot more choice on what we can do with our pension funds. And that's really, really opened up the pension landscape to us all. The problem with choice is that it also comes with a lot of decisions to make, and that can be quite daunting. And so again, I'll go back to the point that when you are coming to retire, when you are exploring how you should be taking that income, is to talk to a financial advisor and seek advice. Some of the decisions you can make with that pension fund can be irrevocable. They are a one-off decision. So make sure you're making the right decision for you at that time. So I would urge everybody to have a look at that. The other thing to bear in mind is also there are still rules around pensions. Although it's a much more flexible landscape, there are still rules in place. There's a minimum age requirement. So you have to be in the main age 55 before you can draw on a pension scheme. That there is talk of that increasing, and so that minimum age will increase because we are living longer. That's the fundamentals of all of these increases in state retirement age and the minimum age you can take your pension. So there are rules around that. You can also take some of your pension fund as tax-free cash, and then the rest of it can go to purchase an income or provide an income. You can take all of it as tax-free cash, but all of these key things, not tax-free cash, sorry, as cash, but there are tax implications every step of the way. So again, stressing that financial advice is key at that stage to make sure that you're not making a decision that's then going to get you hit with a very sizable tax charge. So there's lots of decisions to make. With retirement planning, sorry, Mel, I was just going to say there's key things that we need to make in place. Pensions are wonderful and they have their position, but we would always stress that you do need to have funds in other assets, particularly a cash fund. I'd urge everybody actually, to have an emergency fund and have that in an easily accessible cash fund, so that you can actually, if the boiler goes, anything like that, you can actually access that money, get that fixed and get that sorted for you without actually having to tap into pension funds. Keep your pension funds earmarked for retirement and have an emergency fund earmarked for emergencies. And by having that discipline, you'll be far more likely to achieve your retirement goals.
Absolutely. But there are limits. We talked a lot about tax relief and the huge value of that. But there are limits on how much you can pay into a pension and still benefit from tax relief, aren't there? Could you explain what these are and what happens if you go above these limits?
Absolutely. So the key thing to remember is when you are paying into a pension, you can pay in up to, in any one tax year, up to 100% of your income into a pension plan. However, that is capped at £40,000. Okay, so if you're fortunate to earn over £40,000, you will be capped at £40,000. It's a nice problem to have, to look at that. That's the gross figure. Okay, so you would pay net of basic rate tax relief to get that benefit into your pension plan. And that's what we call the annual allowance. So that's the government putting a restriction on how much you can pay into a pension plan in any 1 year. If you were to exceed that, you do run the risk of having an additional tax charge. And how that is calculated is based on individual circumstances. So they'll work through that and let you know what your additional tax charge would be. Try and stay within the limits would be the key thing there. The other thing that you can utilise there is the benefit of what we call is carry forward, whereby you can carry forward any previously unused annual allowance from the previous 3 years. There's lots of rules around this as well, and there's some calculations to be done. I would stress, again, have a look at the Restless website. There's a fantastic article on carry forward. Have a look at that and then speak to a financial advisor to make sure that you are making the right decision, that the calculations are right, and that, again, you're not falling foul of paying too much in and running the risk of paying an additional tax charge. So that's the annual allowance. There's another limitation, and it's called the lifetime allowance. And this is where, okay, government said how much we can all pay into our pensions each year. But what they've also said is there is a cap on how much our pension plans can grow to before we get hit by another additional tax charge. And that's called the lifetime allowance, okay? And the current lifetime allowance is £1,073,100, okay? So that's the annual allowance as it stands at the moment until the end of this tax year. That is likely to stay in place unless we hear something different over the next couple of days in the spring announcements. But it's a case of that's likely to stay in place for the next few years. It used to keep pace with inflation, but it's now being fixed for a little while. And what happens if you do exceed that lifetime allowance, there is a 55% tax charge on anything over and above that lifetime allowance. So it is one to be mindful of, and particularly for those people that are in what we call those defined benefit schemes, where you are receiving a workplace pension that's based on the number of years you worked there and your salary at the time you left. They are the fund value of those plans isn't as obvious as in the defined contribution, because that's what you're looking at constantly. So it's always worthwhile having a check to make sure that you're not running the risk of breaching any lifetime allowances. There's one further allowance that we need to be mindful of, is especially for those that start to do, say, a phased retirement. If you were to draw an income from any of your defined contribution pensions, you would automatically then invoke what we call the money purchase annual allowance, which would then cap any future pension contributions at £4,000 a year. Okay, so that's only if you were then to be drawing down from a defined contribution pension. There are other rules and conditions around invoking that money purchase annual allowance. But again, what I would say is speak to a financial advisor when you're coming to the stage of working through, is now the right time to take in income? If it is right, at least be aware of what the impact is of what what drawing that income is, and the impact that it can have on any future pension contributions you wish to make.
Thanks, Katrina. And again, just going back to where your pension is invested and why that's really important from numerous different angles, but lots of people who we touched about how people who may be a while off retirement can hope that the value of their retirement savings might recover from recent volatility. But what do you say to people whose pension investments, they've seen the value of their funds plummet, and they might be just really worried that they can't retire? Have you got any tips or help for those people in that boat?
The key thing is to remember that pensions in the main are a long-term investment. So it's a case of we start out and we start investing in them, and they are seen as a long-term investment. So hopefully anybody that's on the call that's experienced the dips in the markets over the last few years have got a few more years to go before they actually start to need those pension investments. And what we can see is through historically, when the markets dip, they will then recover, they'll dip again. It's a cyclical thing, which is wonderful if you've got time for it to recover. Because what you can actually take advantage of, and particularly if you're paying in on a regular basis, is when you are paying in and the markets are down, you're actually buying more units for your pound. So actually, when they then pick back up in value, you've managed to buy more of them. And so as they grow, so you can see more growth longer term. That's wonderful if you've got the benefit of time on your side. So you're looking at growing those funds and so on, and retirement's a little way off. So you can kind of stick tight, keep with it, keep investing, and taking advantage of those lower unit prices at the moment, and really start to pay into those units and buy more of them, so that when they pick back up in value, your fund will reflect that, which is a wonderful opportunity. However, not everybody will be in that position where they can actually, stick with it and see out the storm. What you could also look at doing is, rather than accessing pension funds when the markets are slightly depressed as they are at the moment, is have you got any cash savings? So going back to those emergency funds and so on. So having a look at, is there other sources of income or assets that you have that you could utilize now to bridge that gap whilst the markets recover? So just looking at the choices. Again, this is where advice becomes invaluable. If you have set up your retirement income through an advisor, they will plan for these eventualities. They will plan for dips in the market, how long it recovers, how long can your income and your lifestyle sustain any dips. And that's what we call capacity for loss. So they'll have a look at that. But if you have any concerns and you're thinking of what should I do, then I would urge you to speak to a financial advisor.
So for those who are about to retire imminently, what options do they have for drawing an income from their pensions?
Yes, there are lots of options now. It's a very changed. If we go back sort of 10 or so years or 20 years, it was very much, there was one option, was when you came to retire, you had your fund available, and what you would do is you would go out and you would purchase what we call an annuity. An annuity is a product which would give you a guaranteed income for life. Okay, so a wonderful product, a guaranteed income for life. The key things to remember with annuities, who they suit are those that need certainty. So they're looking to budget and they need to know month on month exactly what's coming in. Also those that have no appetite for investment risk. So they have concerns over peaks and troughs in the markets and so on. The upside of annuity is it's a guaranteed income for life, wonderful benefit. So if you live to 104, it will pay till you're 104. It doesn't deplete, it doesn't run out, it keeps paying to you. The downsides to an annuity is, unless you make the appropriate decisions when you first set the plan up, it will die with you. So if you were to die 2 years after taking out the annuity, and you haven't built in a dependence annuity or other things that you can build into it, it will stop paying at that point, and that's it. And any money that you may have paid is then left with the annuity provider. So there are things that you can do when you are purchasing an annuity to make sure that you can pass it on to other generations and so on. So you can build in dependence pensions, you can build in capital protection, guaranteed periods and so on. So there's lots and lots of add-ons that you can do, but every single one of those add-ons will drive down that initial income rate. So it will drive down what you can expect as an income. It's similar to car insurance. Every add-on, every bell or whistle you add on, it drives it down that starting point for you. So that's an annuity, a guaranteed income for life, wonderful if you live on and so on. And also the other key thing to remember with that guaranteed income for life is, especially when people are living 20, 30 years in retirement, you may want to look at actually including increases in that guaranteed income for life, which again will drive down that initial starting income that you could get from it. So explore annuities. The other option we have now is what we call pension drawdown. And that's where you keep your pension funds. So instead of encashing them and purchasing a product such as an annuity, you actually keep those pension funds invested. And what you do is you draw an income from those invested funds. So you can either do that on a regular basis or an ad hoc basis or one-off lump sums every now and then, whatever suits your retirement plan. The benefit of doing that is that you can then keep the bulk of your funds invested and benefiting from any increases in the markets. And so you can see your fund grow and gives you the benefit of having potentially higher income. The downside of that approach is you could run out of money. So if you were taking too much income over a sustained period, and for example, if the markets weren't working in your favor, you could potentially run out of money. And that's, again, is one of those key things, is speak to a financial advisor. They'll work with you to work out what is a sustainable level of income to actually draw from those plans. Keep an eye on them, work with them, looking at the markets, making sure that if you take X amount of income, how long is that going to provide for you, and so on. So making sure, so that gives you a wonderful opportunity, but it carries the risk of running out, but fundamentally of running out of money. The other great thing about those is that you can leave them to future generations, so that you can pass those on to your children, your spouse, and so on. You can make nominated beneficiaries, and if anything were to happen to you, any of the funds that are invested are then paid out to your dependents. If that happens before age 75, it's actually paid out tax-free. And if it happens after age 75, then it's paid out, and the tax rate is at the recipient's marginal rate. You can also take the pension fund as a lump sum. You can just totally encash that. Part of that is tax-free cash. In the main, with most pension funds, you can get 25% of the fund as tax-free cash. There are always exceptions. That's the golden rule with pensions. There'll be a rule, and then there'll be the exceptions under the rule, and further exceptions. That's how pensions work. But in the main, it's 25% is tax-free cash. You could then encash the balance. However, you would have to pay tax on that balance. And that comes at a very high tax rate. So you would want to seriously consider that, and not to stumble into that decision. Make sure you're talking to somebody, you understand how you're going to be taxed, and you understand how that's going to impact your fund. Also, if you're just going to encash that pension fund and put it in a bank account and then live off that, the other key thing to remember there is you have got an inflation risk. So you're putting it into cash. And we're seeing at the moment, cash funds aren't giving us great returns, but inflation is creeping up. And so it may be the best thing is to leave it invested and draw an income from that, rather than totally in cash, get a tax hit, and also then put it in a fund that's going to be open to inflation risk. There's all of these options available to you, and there's also a mix. You can do a little bit of everything, really. You can do set up an annuity for your baseline, your minimum income requirement, and look at keeping the rest of it invested for your discretionary spend. So there's lots of choices. Choice is great, but it can be quite daunting. So seek help, get somebody to help you through those decisions. The key thing to remember is all of those options are only available to defined contributions and pensions. So those pensions that you've grown and you've got a fund value, those are the choices available under those schemes.
So what about people with defined benefit or final salary pensions? What if they want to take advantage of some of these more flexible options?
Yeah, the key thing with defined benefit, as we spoke before, they work on the guaranteed pension premise. So you've got a guaranteed income for life. Normally, they'll also provide a dependence pension. They'll normally also provide increases in line with inflation and so on. So it is a wonderful benefit. However, if you didn't want to do that and you wanted more flexibility, you would have to consider transferring your fund away from the defined benefit arena into the defined contribution arena. Now, this carries huge risks. It's a huge risk environment, giving up a known guarantee to then try your luck with what you can produce on a defined contribution basis. You would need to seek financial advice. There are pension transfer specialists that are the only people that can give you advice on these types of transfers. Their starting point will be do not transfer. And it's a case of they then have to justify reasons outside the norm. So you would have special circumstances. It could be you have guaranteed income sources from other areas and so on that will cover your income requirements and so on. There are reasons that you can transfer, but the starting point is do not transfer. I would urge anybody to speak to a pension transfer specialist. It's a highly specialised, high-risk area of financial advice. Not something that we offer at Restless. So we provide financial advice, but we don't provide financial advice on defined benefit because it is a specialist area. So have a talk to somebody. Most companies will offer you what they call a bridged advice, which is a really good sounding board for whether there is any viability to that transfer. But honestly, the starting point is do not transfer, and then you work from there.
What about people who might have, say, lots of defined contribution pensions, perhaps because they've worked for a number of different employers over the years? Is it worth them transferring their pensions into one plan, for example, or is it worth them just leaving them as they are?
Yeah, it's one of these things. It seems like the obvious and logical thing to do because it'd be easier to manage and you've got it all in one place as opposed to all these pieces of paper coming in over the year and keeping track of all your pensions. So it seems like an obvious thing to do. There are certain things you need to be mindful of is which plan do you consolidate them into? So it's having a look and an understanding of all the charges that are payable under each one of your separate pension plans, comparing that to what's now currently out there, because what we've seen is quite a competitive marketplace for pensions. And what that's been is the benefit to everybody on this call today is it's driven down those management charges and so on. So it's quite a healthy environment now to look out and compare, particularly older style pensions, and see whether actually some of the newer style pensions will give you a lower ongoing cost, which means, again, more of your money is invested. And then you could consider consolidating into a newer contract, which would also give you the flexibility that we spoke about, drawdown and so on. All of those things come with it. But the other thing that we mustn't walk past is also some of those older type pensions may well have some hidden benefits. There is guaranteed growth rates, there's guaranteed annuity rates, there's lots of things that are hidden within some of these older style contracts. And so if you know what you're looking for, you'll find them and you'll be able to equate them and be able to analyse them and think, is that a valuable benefit to me? If it is, then you may well want to keep that fund. If it's not a valuable benefit to you, you may well want to consider still going ahead with transfer, but it's uncovering those benefits and then weighing up their value. And again, that's where financial advisors come into their own to do that analysis for you. The other thing to look at is also investment options. Under some of the older style pensions, you're restricted on your pension, your investment options. And again, the new ones may give you more opportunities to have something that's more suitable to your outlook for your retirement funds.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katrina. That's been incredibly helpful. Now I'm going to open it up to everyone who's watching, and we've had some great questions already, so through a few of those. First question is, what would you say is a reasonable management charge for a SIP?
Oh, crikey, how long is a piece of string? It's a case of, there are, the key things for management charges is there's a management charge, there's often a fund manager charge, there can also be standing charges, administration charges, and so on. So it's a case of weighing up what you're paying in total. So looking at all of those individual elements. For example, when stakeholder came in, it was devised to drive down charges to 1.5 as a starting point, 1% after so many years. And then, of course, auto-enrollment came along, which drive down the maximum charge under an auto-enrollment scheme as 0.75%. So if you use those as they're sort of dictated by the government, if we use those as baseline charges, I would say anything working within those parameters. So an auto-enrollment scheme has to be 0.75. So working within those parameters. If you're paying over and above, it may be because you are selecting specific investments that are specialist, require specialist management and attract higher costs. So having a look at what is it that I'm actually paying for. If it is that you're paying for specialism because that's what you want, then you need to pay for specialism. However, if you've stumbled into paying for specialism and it's not actually your preferred choice, then you really need to review and make a decision.
Thank you. And we've had another question going back to the triple lock. And we just had a question asking if we could briefly explain how that works.
Right, so basic state and the new state pension as well, habits die hard. It's a case of the state pension that you receive will increase each year, and what they currently have wrapped around them is what they call a triple lock, and that's where they look at inflation, CPI, and also wages. So they take into account those three elements. So looking at the wage increases that are going on in the country, the CPI increases, and also inflation. And they then decide out of those is the increase that you're going to get. So they're looking at three markets, as opposed to just saying it's a flat 2%, 1%, whatever. They are taking into account real life living conditions and increasing the basic state pension by those amounts. Although it never seems like it's a great amount, actually those are quite valuable benefits. And there's lots of talk, I think a little while ago, was looking at stripping away some of those, that triple lock. Fortunately, it still exists. None of this is guaranteed, of course, but it still exists at the moment, and it is a very valuable benefit. Just to keep anything that keeps your income, helps your income keep pace with inflation, is valuable.
Fantastic, thank you. And how do you, another question, how do you find out the value of the fund of a defined benefit pension? As we said, it's easier to find that out if you have a defined contribution plan, but how would someone go about finding out there?
Yeah, so you can contact the trustees of your scheme or the pension provider, and what they can do is provide you with a cash equivalent transfer value, a CETV. Now, they will normally do this once a year. And so you can ask for it once a year. If you ask for it more often, they may well charge you for providing that. And that's because there's normally quite a lot of calculations that go into coming up with that cash equivalent transfer value. But first port of call is always speak to your pension trustees or the pension provider, and they will provide that to you. Often you will get sent that if they are looking to if you're getting close to retirement, so you're looking at your options, but certainly in the first port of call, go to them, ask them for it. I believe under current legislation, they have to provide it to you at least once a year if you request it, but they can reserve the right to charge for any further requests in any calendar year.
Wonderful, thank you. And obviously we've talked a lot about having a financial advisor in this section. We've had a question asking what would the typical cost be of doing this?
Right, so I can tell you about the restless pension advice proposition. We're working on a clear and transparent basis. We are at fixed costs. So if you are in the process of building up your retirement funds, which we call the accumulation phase, so you're accumulating funds, our advice charge is £995, okay? And that can often be deducted from the pension fund rather than you paying out of your own pocket. If you are at the stage where you are actually retiring, the cost, so that's what we call decumulation, so you're starting to draw on those funds, that would cost you £1,495. And the reason for the difference in the charge is because it is a far more complex area. You're making those big decisions where we're looking at sustainability of your fund and so on. So a lot more work goes into it. Our flat fee basis is quite unique in the marketplace. The majority of financial advisors will normally charge you a percentage of your fund as an initial advice charge, and then they will charge you an ongoing advice charge, which again is a fixed percentage. Those percentages are normally around, as an initial advice charge, anywhere between 2 and 5%. And the ongoing charge is normally around 0.4 to 0.6%. It all depends on what you negotiate with your financial advisor. Those ongoing advice charges you'll pay year in, year out, and it is a percentage of your fund. So the more your fund grows, the higher that charge will be. The basis that we work on at Restless is very much as a pay-as-you-go model. And if you did want annual reviews and you did want additional advice, we offer that, but we offer that at a flat fee of £595 once you've done the initial advice. So there's huge disparities out there in the marketplace. Speak to your financial advisor, find out how much you're paying for that. Again, often, if you are paying for ongoing advice, that's coming out of your pension fund directly. So less of your fund is actually invested for your growth and so on. So have a dig around. It's not just annual management charges that you could be paying in your pensions. It's not just fund manager charges. It often can be advisor charges as well. So really be clear on what you're paying for and what you're getting. Is it value for money? And that's the key question. Review, challenge, find out how much you've got. But that's ours. We are looking really at a different model to try and make it more transparent and easier for people to understand what they can actually be paying.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'll put here, if anyone would like a free pension health check, I'll put the link in the chat shortly. We've had another question from someone saying, if I start taking drawdown from a defined contribution pension and then return to work, will future contributions still be limited to £4,000?
They will be, unfortunately, because it's a case of with the money purchase annual allowance, it's what we look at is crystallisation events, which would then trigger that allowance kicking in. And so you will be capped from that moment on, yeah.
Fantastic. Right, just having a look at. Unfortunately, we can't give specific financial advice, but if you have generic questions, do let me know. We've had a question about deferring the state pension. Do you have thoughts on that, when it might be a good idea, when it might be a bad idea?
Again, I'm going to point you towards a wonderful article on Restless, which is, there is one specifically about this, put in state pensions, and it comes up with this. The key view on that is, if you are still working, and any pension that you draw, whether that's state pension, so on, is all treated as taxable income. So it's a case of, if you're looking at all of your sources of income, as soon as you cross that personal allowance threshold, so as soon as you start earning more than 12,000 and so as soon as you start earning more than that, you will be paying tax on anything over and above. Now, paying tax isn't always the worst thing. So sometimes it's a nice problem to have, because it means that you are actually bringing in enough income to pay tax. But it's a case of, if you don't need that money, it will increase. So every year that you defer, you'll see an increase in your state pension of just under 5.8%. So it does sort of roll up, which at the moment, when you're looking and comparing it to cash returns, that's quite a favourable amount. But the key thing to remember is, by deferring it, how long do I then have to live for to actually earn that money back, to actually get the benefit of it? So it's just looking at the changes it could make if you were to receive it. Would you be having to pay additional tax on that if you've got other income sources? Do you need that money? If you need it, take it. Don't, sell yourself short. If you don't, then you might want to look at deferring it. You might want to look at the benefits that you can get. If you go to gov.uk, they will guide you and let you know. But then also do bear in mind, how much longer do I have to live for until I actually get the benefit of that coming through?
Thank you. And we've had another question about the tax implications if you continue working at your current place of work and you're receiving a pension from your previous place of work.
Yeah.
Do you know how that pension might be taxed?
So it's a case of the actual pension that you are receiving from your previous place of work is, as I said before, is treated as taxable income. So it goes into your tax stack as such. So you have your employed income, you have your pension income, and then you overlay your personal allowance, and anything over and above the personal allowance is taxable. So it's a case of having a look at that. So that's how it's taxed. If you're looking at, does it cap your contributions into pensions? It depends on what type of pension it is. If it's a defined contribution pension, it doesn't trigger the money purchase annual allowance. If it's a defined contribution pension, unfortunately, in the main, there are exceptions and there are rules and so on, it will trigger that limitation on how much you can pay in moving forward.
That actually leads on nicely to another comment we've had from someone, which says, although saving into a pension seems good, do you pretty much then get taxed 20% on all the money after your full government pension? So it's a case of in with one hand and out with the other.
Yes, potentially. However, 25%, let's not forget, 25% of that accrued fund is paid out tax-free. So you do get a quarter of the fund back as a tax-free element if you wanted it to, and then you would pay tax on any income generated from the balance. So yes, you are paying 20% on the way in. The ideal situation is if we could all be high rate taxpayers and claim 40% on the way in, basic rate tax on the way out. But the key thing is to remember is you are getting that lump sum that's tax-free. So you are benefiting from 20% tax relief going in. You do pay 20% tax relief on what you get out, but a quarter of that fund is tax-free. So it does still work in your favour.
And just a final question, just going back to the what happens when you start drawing down your pension and the annual contribution limits. If somebody starts drawdown but then subsequently stops it, perhaps because they've returned to work, does that mean at that point they can pay more into their pension annually, or is it still is it the fact that as soon as you started drawing down forevermore, you're subject to the fall?
Absolutely. What you've done is you've triggered what we call a crystallisation event, and these crystallisation events will then trigger other allowances to kick in and other caps to kick in, and it's the fact that you've triggered that crystallisation event that you're actually kicking in that money purchase annual allowance yet, and it's irrevocable. Once it's happened, it's happened.
Thank you. And we just had another question, quick question on the state pension. What is the current maximum amount you can receive from the state pension? I know you touched on this earlier.
Yes, so I'll just go back to it so I can get the exact amount. It's £9,339.20.
And that's if you've contributed for 35 years.
That's the 35 years full national insurance contribution record, yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Katrina, for all your invaluable tips and guidance. That's wonderful. And if anyone would like a free pension health check, by all means, do have a look. I'll post the link again here. But thank you once again, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.